Snow blew sideways across the Schnee Eifel on the 19th of December 1944, needling skin and turning breath to glass. Private First Class Eddie Pascal, medic with the 422nd Infantry Regiment, 106th Infantry Division, cupped a GI mess tin and watched steam lift as if the heat were trying to escape to safer country. He taped a morphine syrette to a private's field jacket, tucked the dog tags back into wool, and told the boy to keep his socks dry like every manual said and every foxhole forgot. The fog thickened until trees became smudges on a grey page. Then the artillery registered like a door slamming down the valley. German 105s by the rhythm of their reports and the way fragments sang through spruce. "Doc, keep your kit tight," the platoon sergeant said, voice flat as a shovel. Encirclement had been a rumour at dawn. By mid-morning, the battalion net was a skipped record, and by noon the command post slid backward over ice. White scarves in the timber flashed and vanished. The medic pack bit his shoulders as if it had teeth. Whatever the map said, by afternoon they were inside a pocket, and the pocket was shrinking with every shell that found a bend in the road. A runner brought a truth thinner than the paper it rode. If the regiment did not break out by night, it would not break out. Somebody said the 1929 Geneva Convention would protect medics and prisoners. Somebody else asked if paper could feed a man. Pascal checked his bag again, bandages, morphine, a little Bible his mother had mailed with a square of chocolate, then capped his mess tin to save what heat he could. The lieutenant with a week's beard climbed a hummock and lifted what had been a T-shirt and was now a flag. He did not look like surrender. He looked like a man measuring the arithmetic of blood against the arithmetic of minutes. They went down off the ridge in a stiff column, rifles slung muzzle down, hands high. The Germans came in tight files, helmets rimed with ice, MG-42s slung, breath ghosting. A Feldwebel with wind-burned cheeks pointed with two fingers toward the road and spoke in a flat voice that would have been polite in a different century. Paschal raised his hands, then bent and picked up his aid bag because no one had told him a medic could surrender his tools. They moved past a culvert where a truck lay jackknifed like a broken insect, past rails kinked by bombing, past a farmhouse with boards over its windows and smoke leaking from seams. He learned how cold metal tastes when your tongue touches a canteen rim. He learned the weight of a mess tin after the heat has gone out of it. He learned that the word later changes meaning when you are walking into a country that will not feed you. A sergeant held up a pamphlet with a red cross printed neat on the cover and said a word Pascal understood. Genfe. Geneva. The food parity clause lived there in ink, rations equivalent to those of depot troops. The road told a different story. Frozen ruts, empty wagons, horses with ribs like washboards, and the smell of raw wood smoke from shuttered farmhouses. A boy in a cap too large for him watched the prisoners and moved his lips as if counting Americans the way his mother counted beets. Dusk came fast, purple as a bruise. The column turned into a yard where a barn leaned into the wind like an old soldier. Inside, the air was sour with hay and damp rope. A guard cracked a joke that made the older men smile without warmth. The Feldwebel repeated, Genf, Genf, as if naming the law would feed it. Paschal lay on a plank with the aid bag for a pillow and listened for artillery that did not come. Somewhere a prisoner hummed a song about a train out of Georgia. Somewhere a kettle clicked emptily, like a clock with no hands. He pressed his palm to his mess tin and felt only the ghost of heat. In the morning they would march east toward a camp whose name he did not yet know, Bad Orb, Stalag 9B, toward ladles of green soup and the knowledge that hunger can be measured in leaves. He closed his eyes and told himself what medics told the wounded when medicine ran out. Count to 10, breathe steady, hold on until the next man arrives. The next man, he believed then, would be carrying food. The next man, he would learn, was days and miles away, and the miles would be counted by footsteps on ice. The ink froze on the stamp before the impression took, so Lieutenant Karl Betke breathed on it and tried again. The Luftwaffe eagle blurred on the ration voucher and dried crooked, which felt appropriate for February 1945. He had been pulled from an air depot desk and given orders for prisoner of war administration, a quiet sentence written in the bureaucrat's dialect. On the train north, he read the 1929 convention, feeding, housing, medical care, then folded the booklet and stared at fields where the snow lay in wind-peeled ribbons and the hedgerows hoarded blackbirds. When he reached the storeroom behind the wire, guards stood around splintered crates like men at a wake. Potatoes gone soft, bread gone grey, coffee, ersatz, and bitter as gnats. A master sergeant from the Landesschützen blinked at him and said, "Herr Leutnant, we will need miracles in writing." The camp ledger was a war all its own. Columns neat as parade ranks, numbers that marched towards zero. Betke copied the ration table, equivalents with the depot troops, and then marked the truth. Priority trains went to units facing the Soviets. Wrecked bridges, stranded wagons. Red Cross parcels arrived irregularly, sometimes not at all. He sent a wire asking for flour and salt and received a reply instructing him to economize on kettles. He wanted to laugh. He inventoried the kitchen. Kettles, yes. Calories, no. In the quarantine barrack, men coughed with a sound like wet paper tearing. They were Americans mostly, flyers thick with gallows humour, and a few English who made jokes dry enough to cut kindling. He told himself he was a professional and that the law could still bind human behaviour even if it could not conjure wheat. It would have been true last year. Orders came at dusk, badly typed and urgent. Prepare to evacuate non-commissioned prisoners west if the Soviet advance broke the line. He read the distances and the cold like a meteorologist reads pressure. March discipline would hold a day, perhaps two. After that, the men would trade weight for life. He issued instructions that would have seemed sensible in 1942, stoves every so many prisoners, carts, ration breaks, then watched them erode under the first night's wind. In a farmer's barn, guards scraped thin soup from the bottom of a kettle and counted the uncountable. How many men were falling behind, how far to the next station, how empty the sacks. In the morning, a sentry's fingers would not move. Betke gave the man a vitamin tablet meant for prisoners because triage is a language that humiliates everyone who speaks it. He checked the figures again and found that arithmetic could be as cruel as shrapnel. The food on hand could not meet the paragraph he had memorized. Trucks, when they came, carried promises and wounded. Rail cars, when they came, carried refugees and orders to move again. He walked the wire once at midnight and listened to prisoners whispering in American English about mess halls and milkshakes and a ball team from Ohio. The words sounded like a country he had never seen and now would never see, except in crates stamped with distant cities and dated like museum labels. When he closed the ledger, he felt as if he were swallowing paper. He told himself men could live on thin soups for weeks. He told himself that duties performed honourably mattered even when results failed. In the guard hut, a sergeant cleaned the frost from a rifle bolt with breath, the simplest field expedient, and asked if the lieutenant believed in spring. Betke said yes, because he had been trained to lead. As he stepped back into the yard, he looked at the camp through the lens of his profession and saw a diagram with broken arrows. The legal system had not vanished. It had simply been displaced by the physics of scarcity. He clicked the pen and wrote one more requisition for flour, salt, and mercy. Then he set the requisition beside the stove to dry, warmed his hands over it, and prepared to march men who were supposed to be protected by law into a winter that recognized only supply. In his pocket, the Geneva booklet bent along its spine, a paper promise buckling under real weight. Forklifts weaved between towers of Red Cross parcels like bombers in close formation, and the echo of pallet wood on concrete sounded like artillery in reverse. First, Lieutenant Ruth Delgado signed manifests until her wrist ticked. New York's port of embarkation ran on a mixture of coffee, ledgers, and the faith that numbers could be turned into nourishment across an ocean. Cases of evaporated milk, tins of meat, chocolate bars, vitamin tablets, soap, razor blades, packed to a standard, listed by lot, routed by the inch. She chalked camp names on a wall map, Stalag 9B, Stalag Luft 4, Hammelburg, and then circled them again, because the rails inside Germany were being interdicted faster than teleprinters could reroute. Rail disruptions expected, the cable warned, as if the word expected could hold a bridge. The paradox arrived slowly, and then all at once. Ships made harbour on schedule, cranes boomed, and the warehouse aisles narrowed under a flood of parcels that could not all be pushed through the broken plumbing of the Reich. Surplus in a season of hunger. Delgado walked the rows with a clipboard and felt the peculiar guilt of wealth. She knew the doctrine. Relief flows through neutrals. Parcels move under the emblem that civilized nations are supposed to honour. Depot troops eat, and so do prisoners. She also knew what a railroad viaduct looks like after a bomb group has done its work. She was not sorry for the work. She was only sorry for the men on the wrong side of the broken line. She ran the figures for an evening briefing because numbers, presented honestly, can teach. Tens of millions of parcels organised across the war. Ships measured not by names, but by tonnage. Turnaround times that would have made a peacetime port boss blush. She wrote one statistic on the board that made the new clerk laugh because it sounded like propaganda and wasn't. At its 1944 peak, the Willow Run plant could complete roughly one B-24 Liberator an hour for a heavy bomber, rivet lines, engines, wiring, radios, the works. The clerk stopped laughing. Delgado let the number breathe in the room like a hymn. If a single factory could do that for aircraft, how many cans, crates and cartons could the nation pour into a war that bent as much on feeding as on firing? She threaded practicalities through the ore. Parcel integrity mattered at the foxhole and inside the wire. Too much fat after starvation could kill as surely as too little. Too much weight on a march turned from gift to liability. Each box, if it reached a prisoner, had to be a ration plan as well as a morale message. She penciled instructions into the margin. Rotate chocolate and cheese. Keep tobacco moderate. Vitamins in sealed tins. Label in German and English. Lot tracking maintained for swaps at neutral depots. Then she added in neat script a line she did not send. We can feed them if we can reach them. At the end of shift, with the warehouse quiet enough to hear the huff of the heaters, she stood with a dockman and looked at rows of crates that rose like city blocks. The dockman said his kid could not imagine running out of milk. Delgado said her job was to make sure some other kid's father did not run out of hope. She wrote IXB on the chalkboard again, then squared the question mark with a second stroke, because stubbornness is a logistics virtue. If she could have sent the smell of coffee and the sound of cans opening ahead of the pallets, she would have. Instead, she sent numbers and prayed that Allied bridges, Bailey and otherwise, would catch up. The map on the wall showed Europe shrinking under American tonnage. The hardest thing was knowing that victory in the realm of supply could arrive days before peace reached the men who needed it most. The road climbed into the Spessart Hills and then spit the column out onto a shelf above a quiet German spa town, the roofs black with melt. Stalag 9B sat on that hillside like an unfinished geometry problem, rows of barracks at imperfect angles, wire glinting, a gate that looked both flimsy and forever. Intake was a lesson in subtraction. A corporal took Eddie Pascal's belt, shoelaces, pocket knife, and the square of chocolate tucked beside his Bible. He left him with a number. The delousing powder burned the scalp. The barracks smelled of wet straw, sour wool, and a faint animal reek that clung to long boards and low ceilings. A man coughed and did not stop. Another man sat carefully on a lower bunk and began to cry the way men do when they have run out of other languages. Breakfast came in a dented kettle that banged like a bell against the doorframe. The guard held a ladle as if it were a badge and poured a greenish liquid that looked like lawn clippings floating in weak tea. Turnip tops, chopped greens, Grass, some men said, because that is what it looked like, and that is what they were tempted to eat later. Pascal tasted the soup and tasted the camp. You could count the leaves, you could count the days. The clinic corner, in truth a badly lit end of a room, filled with dysentery cases. He pinched cheeks to test skin turgor, scolded men into sipping slow, and made salts out of ash and clean water because a man's insides can be coached even when they cannot be cured. He wrote names he would not forget on a scrap of carton. The scrawl looked like a casualty list written by Weather. Roll call was a lesson in standing without falling. Guards in Luftwaffe parkas shouted numbers while older Landesschützen watched as if they were seeing a winter they had seen before and were determined to survive this one too. A parcel rumour moved down the room like a flame. Pascal did not crush it, because rumour is a kind of vitamin. Work details took men down the hill and back past civilians who kept their eyes on the ground. He learned the weeds of the hillside. Wild onion bulbs would help a man believe he had eaten. Dandelion stems gave the jaw something to do, and the mind a small victory. He learned to hide a handful of leaves inside the cuff of a sleeve and to chew them slow enough to trick the stomach. In the evenings, the barrack settled into the sounds of men trying to be somewhere else. Someone told a joke about a stateside mess hall. Someone remembered the way bacon smells on a hot pan in August. Pascal thought about how the law had promised parity with depot troops, and how parity sounded like a foreign word in a place where soup looked like grass. He did not hate the guards. He hated the arithmetic that had put them on one side of a ladle and him on the other. Through cracks in the boards he could see the valley light like a string of coins. He thought of the word later again, and of the man who would bring it nearer. On a Sunday, the wind shifted and carried a different smell up the slope, exhaust with a hint of octane, and he felt it before he believed it. A rumour of armoured cars circling in the Kinzig Valley. An old man in town tracing a map on the air with a stick. A kid in an oversized cap practicing the English for hello. Pascal lay down and put the Bible under his head, and told himself what medics tell the wounded when time is the only tourniquet. Hold on, breathe steady, count. If he closed his eyes, he could see a kettle hissing, but this time the hiss was not the sound of water boiling away. It was the sound a can makes when it opens. The column from Pomerania made a sound like a chain dragged over ice. Lieutenant Karl Betke walked beside the guards because an officer who marched with prisoners could ask things of both. The order had been ordinary: evacuate west before the Soviets cut the rail. The reality was a negative sum. The first day the men carried everything: blankets, tins, letters, a poker chip from Reno someone swore was lucky. By the third day, they traded weight for life. Tins went first, cold meat arcing into ditches unopened. It was an obscenity that felt like wisdom. Abundance, when translated into kilograms on a shoulder, could kill you as surely as hunger. Betke recorded distances, temperatures, and a tally of feet that would not fit into boots again. They slept in barns when they could, and under hedges when they could not. He watched a guard pour ersatz coffee and saw the steam rise like hope. He shared his own ration because decency is not a doctrine, it is the thing a man does when no one is counting. He gave a vitamin tablet meant for prisoners to a sentry who could not feel his hands and hated himself for that arithmetic. Civilians appeared like footnotes on the road, women with scarves tight under chins trading a potato for a button, boys kicking frozen clods the way boys everywhere kick at time. A farmer's wife slipped a bulb of onion to a prisoner and whispered a prayer that was older than flags. Logistics, Betke realized, had turned his profession into weather. The best plan could do nothing when the bridge 3 kilometers ahead lay in black water, and the next bridge carried refugees, and the road beyond had been scored to mud by a regiment that had marched too quickly to leave tracks legible to anyone but the sky. He thought about the law again, the clause on food parity, and felt the paper go soft in his pocket. This was not a collapse of honour so much as a collapse of capacity. He rehearsed the phrase to himself because words, like men, need practice under stress. On the fifth night, a front came through and wrote its name on the camp with sleet. The guards clustered around a stove ringed by bricks that had once been a schoolhouse wall. A prisoner told a story about New York that made everyone smile briefly, not because they understood it, but because they wanted to live in a world where a slice of hot pizza at midnight could be an ordinary fact. The march set off again before dawn, and the road offered its lesson without malice. Any calorie not in the belly is a liability in the pack. Betke logged another day and drew a thin line through another row of numbers that did not add up. He dreamed sometimes, even awake, of trains running on time and of warehouses where crates rose like orderly cities. He had seen that in photographs smuggled into German newspapers before such photographs no longer helped morale. The Americans lived inside those pictures, he thought. They would have words for what he was watching: supply discipline, sanitary measures, field kitchens, unit integrity, and they would make those words exist in the world with engines and bridges and fuel. He was not ready to surrender that night or the next, but he was ready to admit he had seen enough of physics to know how this road ended. He called the roll, wrote the numbers, and told the guards to share their food as evenly as they could without starving themselves. The wind made a banner out of his scarf. When he tied it down, he realized he had begun to hope for American exhaust on the horizon, not because it would vindicate him, but because it would feed the men he had failed to feed. Ruth Delgado briefed the night shift with the map behind her and the chalk snapping in her hand. Europe seemed to shrink and brighten as she laid down routes from the Midwest to the docks, from the docks to neutrals, from neutrals toward camps that were dots on paper and thousands of hungry bodies, in fact. Ships arrived on schedule. Cranes groaned. Forklifts beeped. The paradox persisted. Victory in the arithmetic of supply before relief in the rooms where it mattered. She spoke in specifics because specifics make belief possible. Tonnage landed this week. Parcels processed. Rail cars promised by partner lines. She held back nothing of the difficulty. She held back none of the pride. The new clerk asked for a number to carry in his pocket. Delgado gave him more than one because numbers, stacked properly, build bridges. America had produced roughly 300,000 military aircraft during the war. In 1944 alone, production sums read like fiction. The Willow Run plant, at its peak, could complete a B-24 Liberator about every hour. Single factories outproduced enemy nations' totals in categories that mattered. She let that hang in the air, then translated awe into action. Pallets labelled, manifests double-checked, seals inspected, parcels sorted to avoid over-fatigue refeeding, vitamins dovetailed into rations, tobacco kept moderate, soap included because dignity feeds a man too. She wrote IXB on the board and underlined it twice. A cable spat from the teleprinter with the cruel grace of honest news, bridges down, rails cut, convoys rerouted. She imagined those bridges rebuilt in miniature on the far side by combat engineers with Bailey panels and a manual that read like scripture. The United States could turn steel into river crossings as casually as other nations turned paper into decrees. That was not boasting, it was a program. She felt the truth the way a mechanic feels a proper engine note. Industrial democracy did not rely on miracles. It relied on schedules and inspectors and citizens who believed that making a latch on a ration crate was an act of war. At shift's end, she walked the quiet aisles and touched the corners of crates as if blessing them on their voyage. She had family who would never understand how a box of powdered milk could be an instrument of strategy, but she did, and that was enough. She pictured the hillside above Bad Orb the way it had been described in signals traffic: a wire, a gate, a barracks, a kettle that played a tinny music against cold doors. She pictured a medic there, nameless to her, but as concrete as the brass of a mess tin, taking slow sips because slow is how you teach a starving body to remember. She permitted herself a private heresy. The thought that opening cans could be as decisive as opening a breech block. Then she corrected herself, not because the thought was wrong, but because it was incomplete. The American genius was not choosing between those actions. It was doing both, at scale, and arriving on time with either. Before she locked the office, she wrote a sentence at the bottom of the day's board and did not erase it when she turned off the light. The food is real, the route is real, the arrival is coming. It was not quite a prayer. It was a statement a professional makes when she can see the bridge in her head and knows the panels are already stacked on the far bank. When dawn pushed against the warehouse windows, she returned to the manifests and felt for a moment the same crisp certainty she felt as a girl tracing rivers on a school map. Follow the water and you will reach the sea. Follow the numbers and you will reach the hungry. Somewhere, she told herself, a kettle would hiss, and this time the hiss would be the sound of a camp filling with food rather than the sound of water boiling away to nothing. The morning roll call at Stalag 9B in March 1945 sounded like wood splitting. The Luftwaffe Parker on the counting sergeant shone with frost. His voice clipped into the wind as if order itself could warm a formation. Eddie Pascal, medic with the 422nd, watched for the sway that meant collapse. He had cut a pinch of salt with clean ash and stirred it into water to coax a few ounces back into the sick. It was what medics did when the aid station became a corner of straw and a tin cup. The barracks exhaled a sour animal smell. Somewhere a kettle knocked against a doorframe, hollow like a clock with no hands. Facts he could not ignore stacked up like rations that never arrived. The camp, swollen with December's captives from the bulge, the depot troop standard of Geneva not met, the Red Cross parcels irregular or blocked. Men whispered grass soup, then discovered the phrase would become a diet. They learned the hillside the way foragers learn a coastline. Wild onion bulbs, small as thumbnails, took the edge off dizziness if you chewed slow, telling the stomach it still had a job. Dandelion stems were currency, slipped into cuffs and traded at roll call with a touch quick enough to count as prayer. On work details, 2 men might risk a reprimand for 6 blades of grass apiece, green trophies smuggled past the gate. Humiliation lived in the arithmetic of it, counting leaves the way a quartermaster counts crates, and yet the counting kept a kind of order. A British sergeant joked that he missed the taste of boredom. An Air Corps kid said he missed the sound of ice clinking in a stateside glass. Paschal missed water that didn't have to be negotiated with. Rumour arrived the way rumour prefers to arrive, uncredited and precise. A farmer on the Valley Road had seen armoured cars. A boy had practised hello at his own boots. A guard at the fence, older Landesschützen, another war stamped into his limp, complained to a friend that fuel was short and orders were long. Even the traffic sounded different now. There was a cleaner note to the engines down below, not the cough of field cars that had been starved as long as their drivers. Paschal folded the sound into the part of his mind that kept men alive. Monitor, ration, prepare to move. He wrote names on a torn carton flap, men who needed watching, and slid the list under straw so it wouldn't get wet with a man's breath. Sunday pretended at spring. Sun spilled onto the yard long enough to throw real shadows. Laughter skated along the bunks at a whisper of Iowa cornfields, and for a minute the room lifted. The guard with the limp watched the prisoners, then looked down into the valley as if measuring a road he had once walked with someone he loved. Pascal forced his thoughts into the practical. He coached a man through sips so small they made sense. He told another to stand with knees soft so the body could lie to the cold. He taught a third how to breathe past hunger cramps by counting heartbeats, the little cheat that kept a medic in business when medicine ran out. By late afternoon the wind shifted and carried a smell his nose had not catalogued in weeks. Gasoline with a clean note, not the stale smoke of scavenged wood. He did not speak it aloud. Men who have been hungry long enough hear with the whole skin. The British sergeant raised his eyebrows and said nothing. The Air Corps kid smiled as if hearing a hymn. "That's ours," he whispered. Not triumph exactly, but recognition. Pascal believed in promises only to the extent they could be boiled, swallowed, and kept down. Even so, the rumour burned like a stove inside him. If the machines with that sound were in the valley, they belonged to a chain that ran back across an ocean. Warehouses, cranes, inspection stamps, the mathematics of a nation that could pour food and steel at the same time and arrive on time with both. That night the barrack breathed in damp wool and a sweetness he could not name. He tucked the list of names under straw and laid his Bible on his chest to feel the millimetre of rise with every breath. He was not praying for miracles. He was praying for vehicles. The difference felt theological and correct. If faith meant anything here, it meant believing in the arrival of something made by hands, M10S with 3-inch clanks, M8S with bright climbing notes, kitchen trucks with kettles that hissed like a front advancing. A dog barked down in bad orb. He put his fingers on the mess tin to feel the ghost of heat and waited for morning, which would come, and with it the next set of numbers a medic could live by. How many steps to the gate? How many bowls to fill? How many men to hold upright until help finished the hill? The road from Pomerania made a sound like a chain dragged over ice. Lieutenant Karl Betker walked beside the column because an officer who marched with prisoners could ask things of both. The order had been bureaucratic and calm. Evacuate non-commissioned prisoners west if the Soviet advance threatened rail communications. And the reality was a negative sum written in windburn and bone. The first day men carried everything, a portable memory palace of wool blankets, letters, poker chips, tins. By the third day they traded weight for life. Tins arced into ditches unopened, a detail that would have sounded obscene to anyone who had not learned the physics of frostbite and distance. Abundance turned to liability when a shoulder chose between a can and circulation. Betker recorded distances, temperatures, feet that would not fit boots again. They slept in barns when permitted and under hedges when permission dissolved. Guards poured ersatz coffee and watched the steam like it might hold off the cold if you stared hard enough. Betker handed a vitamin tablet, meant for prisoners, accounted for on a sheet, to a sentry whose fingers would not obey him. He hated himself for that arithmetic, and yet would have done it again, because triage humiliates the performer and also makes a kind of sense while the wind speaks in teeth. Civilians appeared like footnotes. A farmer's wife trading a potato for a tunic button. A boy kicking frozen clods down a ditch as if the clods were the war itself. A church bell tried to call a village into a rhythm that the road ignored. Procedure dissolved into weather. Field regulations imagined cook stoves at intervals, carts assigned by ratio, rest stops. Bridges removed the imagined. A viaduct written in black water replaced a timetable with a detour. A siding jammed with refugees replaced the diet chart with a blank. Betker held on to the law as long as he could, the clause on rations equivalent to depot troops, and found that the sentence softened in his pocket like paper held too long in a sweaty palm. This wasn't a collapse of courtesy so much as a collapse of capacity. He said it to himself like a catechism because words feel better when repeated with cadence. On the fifth night, a front rolled over them and wrote its name across backs and shoulders in sleet. They crowded into a schoolhouse shell, bricks stacked like red bread around a single stove circle. An American told a story about a diner in Toledo that made even the guards smile, not because they knew Toledo, but because the word pie still had power over the belly. Dawn scraped them up. The road offered its impartial lesson. Any calorie not in the gut is a liability in the pack. The men moved again, a river of wool and breath, and the day paid out in meters and choices. Betker marked another line in the ledger he kept, because ledgers were how he proved to himself he had not surrendered his profession to the weather. He dreamed sometimes, even walking, of photographs clipped and hidden in drawers, American warehouses where crates rose like city blocks, conveyors humming, inspectors initialing seams. bridges assembled from panels by men with manuals who believed instructions were promises the world would keep if you showed up with the parts. Industrial democracy, he thought. He had read the phrase somewhere before reading itself got dangerous. Did not rely on miracles. It relied on schedules and citizens who treated a latch correctly fitted to a ration crate as an act of war. He was not ready to salute the idea. He was ready to admit he had seen its power. The road would end at fuel and food, and the people who had both would own the next sentence. When they reached a crossroads marked by a tree with half its limbs shot away, a boy in a cap too large for his skull waved in an odd semicircle. Practiced English caught in his throat. "Hello," he said, like a messenger from some other century. Betke raised a hand and felt, not treason, but relief. He told the guards to share what they had as evenly as they could without starving themselves. Then he looked down the westward branch and allowed himself the smallest private heresy a uniform can bear. He hoped the first engine note he heard would be American, not because it would vindicate him, because it would feed the men he had failed to feed. The valley opened like a book someone had left out in the rain, pages buckled and road inked dark between lines of pine. Lieutenant Jack Rizzo, 2114 Infantry, 44th Division, read the terrain against orders that had been simple in their poetry. Get up the hill, reach Stalag 9B, and open the wire. The lead elements of the 106th Cavalry Group ghosted ahead, M8 armoured cars slipping around corners with that high, eager engine note that meant the road was theirs unless someone contradicted the statement with fire. Behind, the 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion's M10s growled like well-fed animals, the 3-inch guns seated like arguments that did not need rehearsal. Engineers rode with the column, Bailey panels stacked, because a river is only a rumour to an American unit that brings its own bridge. They worked the approach like a textbook executed by citizens who had built the textbook at a day job. Recon probed culverts and counted demolitions by the length of shadow under broken spans. A handful of Volkssturm tried defiance and were towed off it by the first sustained burst from a .50 on a ring mount. Rizzo rode on the deck of a Sherman, helmet straps tapping his jaw as if the tank were reminding him who carried whom. The smell of exhaust and hot oil felt like doctrine. Close with, overwhelm, pass through. He had served long enough to know that what felt like destiny was really process. Fuel discipline, maintenance intervals, a battalion S4 who could make spare parts appear like saints. They hit the last grade in second gear, rifles up, barrels canted, the column narrowing to fit the hillside. The camp showed itself suddenly, rows of barracks, a wire that looked tired of its own job, a gate that had never been designed to keep a nation's anger out. A watchtower coughed one uncertain round and then subsided like a lie told badly. Rizzo's point man put an M8 against the gate and leaned on the throttle. The hinges announced their resignation. The first Americans through were not riflemen but medics and cooks, the two trades that make victory smell like something a human body recognizes. Inside, men materialized out of straw and willpower. Faces sharpened by weeks of arithmetic stared at cans the way astronomers stare at first light. Rizzo yelled for order because abundance can drown the unready. Coursemen walked the rows with refeeding discipline, small sips, slow spoons, steady eyes. A chaplain no one had seen arrive put his hand on a man's shoulder and told him to listen for his own swallow. The field kitchen's lids lifted, steam proofed the air. Somewhere an M10 clanked its breech open and shut, habit, readiness, and the sound braided with ladles tapping steel. It was as if the army played two instruments at once and had been practicing for years. Rizzo had been taught to honour numbers as much as courage, so he let them speak in his head while the cooks did the first holy work. Roughly 93,941 Americans had been prisoners in the European theatre. About 1,121 had died in German custody. Those numbers mattered because they were made of names. Another number muscled into the scene like a promise kept. By war's end, the United States had built approximately 49,000 M4 Shermans. It was the kind of statistic that felt impossible to men who had been arguing with a single gate. Impossible and yet parked right there, idling on the hill above Bad Orb, proof that a democracy of factories could translate votes and wages into armour and arrive on time. The guards came down from the towers with their hands open, older men with coats too thin for the season and shame worn smooth by repetition. Rizzo posted them to the side and told a corporal to keep them there without cruelty. Victory polices itself, he thought, or it rots from the inside. He found the camp register and made himself read the last week's entries so the dead would be counted as more than rumours. When he stepped back into the yard, a medic was teaching a man how to sip again. Steam laced the wind, cans hissed. The wire looked like a punctuation mark that had been misplaced and finally corrected. They had opened the gate. Now they would open the road home. The first good smell climbed the hillside like a flag. Coffee, meat, a hint of biscuit, scents that returned men to themselves and also demanded discipline. Eddie Paschal moved from bunk to bunk with the steadiness of a man who understood how redemption can be lethal if applied too quickly. He had read, or been told by someone who had read, that a starving body must be convinced, not overwhelmed. The corpsman portioned by ounces, not enthusiasm. A cook with forearms like oak knots murmured, "Easy, gents," as if tone were part of rationing. Bowls trembled in hands that had forgotten their own strength. A kid from the Air Corps cried, stopped, laughed, and apologised for the laughter. The apology, not the tears, made Pascal close his eyes for a second. Outside, Graves' registration chalked names on boards and measured rows. The crosses near the fence had been estimates written by Weather. Now they became entries in a log, the short passage from rumour to record. Rizzo walked with a notebook and gave dignity the only gift an infantry officer can give it: attention. Ilse, the Hessian farm widow who had bartered eggs for flour and traced the war in missing sons, watched a field bakery inflate its canvas like a parachute. American engineers assembled a stove the size of a room with the competence of men who consider instruction sheets a kind of oath. She smelled white bread for the first time in months and felt a ridiculous urge to curtsy to the yeast. The camp's tempo changed from survival to schedule. Medics counted pulses as if counting time itself, then increased portions, then increased again. Soap arrived and turned washing into ceremony. Dignity did its second trick and made men stand taller simply because their hands were clean. A chaplain and a mess sergeant argued about who needed calories first and were both right. Guards, now prisoners by any honest description, sat in a corner with blankets over their knees, older faces slack with relief that someone else had taken command of the weather. Pascal moved a collapsible cot to catch a better angle of light and taught a man how to breathe past a cramp. "Count to 10, he said, then made the man count 11. Numbers threaded the work because numbers are how you tell the truth without performance. The overall American POW fatality rate in German custody, about 1%, did not comfort anyone staring at a particular empty bunk, but it mattered as testament to both suffering and survival. The refeeding plan called for careful escalation by day and protein balanced with starch. A corporal read the guidelines aloud as if they were a pledge. Rizzo scribbled requisitions for blankets, then laughed at himself, because requisitions now felt like formalities in a system that produced blankets by the acre. The kitchen hissed, the M10s idled, and time itself seemed to thicken and hold. Ilse bartered again, this time across a table the Americans had set out as if peace could be staged on lumber. She traded eggs for flour, then stood in line behind men who had been behind wire the day before. No one hurried her. An engineer showed her how a Bailey panel could become a bridge. He used his hands and 2 loaves of bread to illustrate trusses. She did not understand the mathematics, but she understood the feeling of watching something strong click into place. In the evening she carried home a loaf with steam sneaking from a seam in the crust. It warmed her wrist. It warmed a memory that had not been fed since 1943. At dusk, Pascal wrote a letter with a borrowed pencil that left faint silver lines on the page until someone found him a stub of graphite. He listed nothing dramatic. I ate, I slept, I worked. The lines felt better than poetry. He pressed a blade of grass between two Bible pages because superstitions become relics when you survive them. Outside, the kitchen lids knocked a rhythm the whole hillside had begun to understand. The gate hung open without ceremony now, a simple rectangle in a fence. He would have kept moving that night if ordered, but no one ordered it. The new order was rest, food, record, repair. Outside the wire, the road waited, and the road, for the first time in months, seemed to be pointing somewhere generous. In New York, the warehouse lights painted long lanes on concrete and made the stacks of parcels look like city blocks. Ruth Delgado stood with a clipboard and a coffee that had gone cold while she read cables. The message that mattered most was not poetic: camp liberated, parcels redirected to DP. She drew a clean diagonal through IXB on her wall map and wrote displaced persons in small, careful letters, as if neat handwriting could spare someone a cue. The paradox she had lived with, victory in the arithmetic of supply arriving before relief could reach men in rooms, relaxed by a degree. Now the surplus would do what good surplus does, spill into the broken places that needed it. She briefed the night shift the only way professionals indulge in celebration, by issuing tasks. Redirect lots by date and content. Rotate the high-fat tins into safer mixes. Increase soap and razor allotments. Dignity does more work than morale posters, and she intended to run a dignity surplus if she could. Coordinate with civil affairs. Set aside children's parcels with more milk and fewer cigarettes. The teleprinter chattered like a cheerful insect. Dockmen moved pallets with a lightness she had never heard on their machines. She looked at the cranes through a window and thought they moved like ballerinas burdened with good news. Numbers, once more, told the story, because numbers are shy beasts that grow brave when you feed them proof. Tens of millions of Red Cross parcels organised across the war. Millions staged and rerouted at its end. Port throughput that would have made a peacetime boss panic now felt ordinary. She allowed herself a single sentence of wonder. A free people had built a system where crates turned into calories with fewer failures than myths allowed. Then she reminded herself of the rails inside Germany and the bridges that could disappear in a single raid. The victory had never been inevitable. It had been engineered and then maintained day after day by people who took lunch breaks and still managed to outperform a dictatorship that claimed to be built for war. She called her mother between shifts and tried to explain why a box of powdered milk could be an instrument of strategy. "Honey," her mother said, "milk is always strategic." Delgado laughed and wrote the line in the margin of a dispatch. On her desk, the Willow Run statistic lay on a card. One heavy bomber an hour at peak, next to newer cards that reminded her that even after gates opened, the human machine ran on slow repairs. She kept the cards because they reminded her that the impossible can be scheduled if you distribute it correctly across a nation that believes in latches and deadlines. The dock quieted near midnight. She walked the aisles and touched crate corners the way a chaplain touches shoulders. She thought of a hillside in Hesse, a kettle that now hissed the right way, and a medic who had counted leaves like paybooks. She had never met him, and likely never would, but she felt professionally married to the idea of him. Her job had been to make sure that when the American column climbed the last grade, it came with ladles and cans as well as rifles and engines. That had happened. The gate had opened. Now the habit of abundance, the one she had practiced in ledger columns, would become policy on roads, a little rehearsal for the better angels that would later be called plans and programs and eventually aid. Before she left, she re-chalked the board with a sentence she had begun writing at the end of every day. "The route is real. Arrival is coming. Make room." She turned off the light and watched the glow still leaking in strips from under dock doors, the way light leaks from a kitchen in a house where someone has come home late and is warming soup for whoever needs it. She locked up with the ease of someone who trusts what she has built will still be there in the morning. Then she went home and slept hard, dreaming not of numbers, but of ladders leaning against cargo nets, steps you climb while carrying something for someone you will never meet. Morning in Bad Orb came on with a clarity that felt mechanical, as if the light had been calibrated. Eddie Paschal turned a can opener in his fingers and laid a pressed blade of grass beside it on the blanket, a private ledger balanced in 2 artifacts. He would keep the grass because superstition is a kind of receipt. He would keep the opener because steel that fits the hand can redeem a winter. Karl Betke stood by the fence he no longer guarded and repeated softly a sentence from a book he had failed to enforce, rations equivalent to depot troops, like a penitent saying a line he still believed was right. Ilse queued with villagers at a table where Americans distributed flour with the seriousness of priests. Lieutenant Rizzo signed off on the last casualty transfer and let his hand rest a second on the page, honouring ink because ink keeps faith with names. Then the narrative pulled back to the altitude where ore lives. The war's arithmetic sharpened into a panorama, roughly 93,941 Americans held as prisoners in Europe, with about 1,121 deaths in German custody, tens of millions of Red Cross parcels organised and, at war's end, surplus available to feed displaced persons as if victory had planned hospitality in advance, approximately 300,000 American military aircraft produced across the conflict, about 5.4 million M1 Garands manufactured. On the ground, approximately 49,000 M4 Shermans built, statistics that feel impossible until you see the track prints on a Hessian hill and realise the number has parked itself in your field of view. Democracies, when properly organised, can turn lunch pails and paychecks into brigades and bakeries with a speed tyrannies advertise and rarely achieve. Pascal would have told you that strategy tasted like meat and felt like a hand on your shoulder to keep you sitting upright while you learned to swallow again. He watched a corpsman teach a man to sip, as if teaching a child to read, slow beats and small words. Betke would have told you that failure is sometimes the moment you stop lying about capacity. He signed a surrender note with relief that someone else finally owned the weather. Ilse cut white bread at her table and cried because the steam that lifted carried a smell she thought the war had erased. Rizzo walked the fence line and palmed a twist of rusted wire, a souvenir of punctuation retired from duty. American abundance did not correct the winter, it ended the winter's argument. Field kitchens and M10s, Shermans and Bailey panels, forklifts and ledger cards, all parts of a single language that says we will show up in force and in order. The impossible statistic performed its trick again, this time less like spectacle and more like simple fact. A single nation had built more of nearly everything that mattered and had learned how to aim that surplus at hunger and fear with near bureaucratic grace. A bomber an hour at Willow Run, an ocean crossed by ships that left and arrived like heartbeat, crates packed so precisely that a medic in a shed could predict what he would find when he lifted the lid. The cruelty of starvation at the wire had been real, but it had also been an index of an enemy system collapsing under interdiction and arithmetic. When the gate opened, it did so under the weight of numbers that had been marching since 1942. At sunset, Pascal folded the grass into his Bible and tucked the can opener into his pocket. He wrote home with an economy he knew his mother would forgive. I am safe. They fed us. I worked today. The camp lay quiet, smelling of soap and bread and hot metal. Somewhere down in Bad Orb a dog barked, and the sound felt neighbourly. Across the ocean, Ruth Delgado locked her warehouse and set a note for the morning crew. Redirect 2 lots to DP staging. Audit seals. Thank the dockman. A paragraph of ordinary work inside a saga that would be called Victory. Betke sat on a crate and watched the Americans assemble a bridge in a photograph someone passed around. He saw panels become span and recognized for the first time a style of faith he could live with, belief in parts that fit. The day ended the way free nations prefer to end days, with lists complete, with kitchens cooling, with engines ticking quietly as they settled. Grass and steel, hunger and surplus, a gate and a road. The distance between those pairs had been measured in American production and carried on American backs. If the world to come seemed gentler, it was because a democracy had practiced the art of arriving, and arriving with more than enough.